My name is Elise Navarro, and I was 23 the night I realized I was never part of the picture. Not really. The engagement party was for my sister, Marielle. They booked the same upscale venue where I worked part-time, serving tables to people who barely looked up when they handed me their credit cards. It was a place with marble floors, string lights overhead, and just enough distance from our neighborhood to feel aspirational. A week before the event, my stepmother called me into the kitchen. She didn't ask how I was doing. She didn't ask if I had plans that night. She just placed a folded uniform on the counter. Black blouse, pressed slacks, flat shoes that weren't mine, and said, "You'll be on shift. You already know the layout." There was no malice in her voice, only efficiency. "It makes sense," she added, like she was solving for a missing variable in a simple equation. "You work there. You'll blend in." And just like that, I wasn't a guest. I was labor. I didn't argue. I didn't decline. There are moments when you can feel the weight of your own silence pressing into your lungs. This was one of them. On the night of the party, I entered through the back entrance like the rest of the staff. I changed in the employee restroom beneath the flickering light I'd reported twice and the cracked tile that no one had ever fixed. There was a name tag waiting for me. Elise, in plain block letters. No last name, no title, no trace of connection to the family seated in the dining hall beyond the swinging door. The music was soft. The laughter wasn't. Guests filled the room like water, expanding into every corner, raising glasses, giving cheek kisses, posing beneath the floral arch like they were part of something permanent. I carried trays, cleared plates, refilled glasses of people who used to smile at me on Christmas morning. Now they didn't recognize me. Or maybe they did, and chose not to. At 7:30, I was asked to bring 12 flutes of Prosecco to the head table. The tray was heavy, not just with glass and carbonation, but with something older, accumulated. The kind of weight that doesn't announce itself until you try to carry it with a straight back. My sister looked radiant, the kind of beauty you don't question because it's been reinforced since childhood. She wore the same smile she used in school photos, flawless, practiced, and just distant enough to seem effortless. Her fiancé sat beside her, arm around her shoulders like she was already property. I stood behind them as my father rose to make his toast. He didn't clear his throat, didn't tap his glass. He just smiled, lifted his flute and said, "One of my daughters made it." Then he turned, not fully, just enough. The other, well, maybe she'll marry a dishwasher, stay in her league. There was a pause, brief but sharp. Then came the polite laughter, the kind that pretends to be harmless, the kind that leaves bruises anyway. I stood still, not out of discipline, but because I knew if I moved, even an inch, I might disappear completely. I didn't spill, didn't cry, didn't excuse myself to the restroom to breathe through it. I just placed the final glass down, bowed slightly like I'd been trained to do, and turned away as the applause began. No one followed me. By the time the last guest left, the music had faded into silence, and the only sounds left were the scrape of chairs and the hiss of soda from an open bar gun. I was still there, stacking plates, sweeping up confetti, cleaning lipstick-stained glasses that no one would remember touching. When I left through the alley, the night air felt thick. My shoes were damp. The uniform clung to me like it had learned its role better than I ever could. I walked home without checking my phone. There would be no messages, no apology. Just a voicemail from Marielle, maybe, saying, "Thanks for helping out," in a tone that didn't reach her eyes. But I didn't need gratitude. I didn't even need recognition. What I needed, what I started building that very night, was proof. Proof that I wasn't who they said I was. Proof that a girl in a uniform could write her own story if no one else would hand her a pen. So I opened my laptop, went online, and registered for night classes. Hospitality management. 6 credits. No celebration. No champagne. Just me. And the silence that finally started sounding like something I could build on. They never called me the stepchild, not officially, not when company came over, not when we lined up for holiday portraits with Marielle in the middle and me always at the edge of the frame, just far enough for the light to miss my face, just close enough to prove they let me in the room. They didn't need the word. Everything else said it for them. The way my chair at the dining table wobbled slightly, even though no one ever fixed it. The way I was always helping, never hosting, never part of. The way my father, when tired or annoyed, would glance toward me and say, "This one." It was subtle, sharp like paper cuts. Nothing you could scream about, but everything you felt when it bled. When people asked what I did, they'd speak for me. She helps with events. She's organized, keeps the place running. She's a hard worker, just like her mother was. Was. Always was. My mother died when I was 8. Car accident. Black ice. The kind of story you're told twice. Once at the funeral, and again at a future holiday when someone spills too much wine and forgets you were there. They didn't talk about her often. She wasn't convenient for their narrative, not soft enough to mythologize, not bad enough to blame. When she was gone, I was handed over like a box of mismatched china. Moved in with a man who remarried quickly and raised a daughter of his own. A daughter who became the sun, and I, the necessary shadow. Marielle had golden hair and the kind of skin that made photographers ask for more angles. She had laughter that earned a crowd and mistakes that were forgiven before they even landed. She had a bedroom with French doors, a summer in Florence, a private ballet tutor who came 3 times a week and called her darling, even when she refused to rehearse. Everything came easy to her, and everything she touched became a reflection of how well she was loved. She was the real daughter. She didn't need to ask for it. She was it. I was just someone's second draft, useful when needed, tolerated when not. At dinner, I brought plates. At parties, I held coats. At holidays, I cleaned up the wine stains before they reached the rug. They didn't ask me to perform. They simply handed me the script and waited for me to read it. And I did. For years, I did. I convinced myself that gratitude was enough, that if I stayed useful, I'd stay included. That invisibility was safer than resentment, because at least it didn't make a scene. But even silence has a cost. I remember once, Christmas Eve, finding a box labeled "Family Ornaments." Inside were figurines from each year, hand-painted with names and dates. There was one for Marielle, of course. There were even ones for the dog, but not for me. Not a single one. And when I asked, gently, if maybe mine had broken, my father didn't even look up from the paper. He just said, "Well, you were already a bit older when you joined us. We didn't have your baby years. Didn't seem right to pretend. Didn't seem right to pretend." As if pretending I belonged was something they had to do. As if love was something retroactive and I'd missed the window. I nodded, said nothing. But that was the year I stopped trying to earn it. It was Marielle's engagement party, the kind with florals that matched the invite design, with a violinist at the entryway and a signature cocktail named after their dog. The kind where everyone dresses in beige linen and pretends it isn't performative. I wasn't on the guest list. I was on the payroll. At least that's how they framed it. "Just help out a little," my stepmother said, smiling like it was a compliment. She handed me a black apron. said the caterers were short-staffed, said I'd be doing everyone a favor. I didn't argue. By then, I'd learned that saying no only gave them another story to tell, something about how I'd changed, how I wasn't grateful anymore, how it wasn't like when I first moved in and was so eager to help. So I tied the apron, and I worked. For 4 hours, I carried trays of hors d'oeuvres through rooms filled with people who had forgotten I wasn't one of the waitstaff. No one looked me in the eye unless their glass was empty. Even the photographer didn't know what to do with me. He asked if I could clear the frame. I was clearing a table near the head of the garden when the toasts began. Champagne was passed out, except to the staff. I stood near the hydrangeas just behind the stone archway, watching as my father raised his glass and pulled Marielle close. "She's everything I could have asked for," he said, his voice warm, practiced. "One of my daughters made it." A pause, just long enough for the air to still. The other, "Well, maybe she'll marry a dishwasher, stay in her league." The laughter wasn't cruel, it was casual. That's what made it worse. It wasn't meant to humiliate me, it wasn't meant to hurt, because to them, I didn't even matter enough to hurt. I wasn't in the photo, I wasn't in the toast, I wasn't in the story. I cleared another plate, placed it gently in the bin behind the floral hedge, and then I stood there for a while, watching the lights reflect off champagne glasses I hadn't touched, listening to the violinist transition into Coldplay like nothing sacred had been broken. Every insult they gave me became an operational upgrade. They said I lacked ambition, so I built a scalable model with no one noticed when I left. And that was the last time I ever wore that apron, not because I refused to serve, but because I had finally decided what I was building. And it wasn't a scene, it was something bigger. I didn't walk out after the toast. Not that night, not the next day either. I went back to the same restaurant where I'd worked weekends since I was 16, same apron, same prep list, same hollow smile. It wasn't that I lacked pride, it's that I needed data. When you've been invisible for most of your life, you learn to move quietly. You start to notice what others miss. The manager who always asks for just one more favor, the hostess who keeps track of tips she didn't earn, the chef who thinks yelling equals leadership. You memorize schedules, study the peak hours, trace the patterns of failure no one else bothers to fix. And in that quiet surveillance, something shifts. I stopped reacting to insults, stopped absorbing shame like a sponge, stopped trying to prove that I belonged. Instead, I paid attention to everything. Inventory shrink, supplier margins, delivery speed, table turnover, who ran a tight kitchen, who faked it, who really made the place move. And when my shift ended, I didn't crash on the couch like my coworkers did. I poured myself burnt coffee, logged into a dusty secondhand laptop, and started learning what none of them expected a waitress to know: accounting, digital logistics, permit regulations, ghost kitchens, market saturation, driver liability insurance. I didn't understand it all at first, but the numbers made more sense to me than my father ever had, because at least numbers didn't lie to your face, then toast your replacement. Most nights I studied until sunrise, slept in 2-hour windows, and showed up again with a clean apron and unspoken fury. They thought I was compliant, but I wasn't. I was converting rage into infrastructure. The irony was almost elegant. They had trained me in service, and I was using it to design something they'd never understand. Every insult became a blueprint, every slight a systems note. When my father said I should marry a dishwasher to stay in my league, I bookmarked commercial kitchen vendors that same night. When my sister mocked my forever job, I drafted the outline for a delivery system with no storefront, no overhead, and no brand to mock, because I'd finally learned something they never taught me. Legacy is loud, but leverage is quiet. And I didn't want their name anymore. I wanted what their name had shielded from consequence, ownership, not just of a restaurant, but of the entire story. They thought I was stuck at the bottom rung, but I was holding the ladder steady until I was ready to move, and when I did, no one would hear me climbing, only the sound of doors closing behind them. They never asked why I stopped working weekend shifts. Maybe they assumed the restaurant had let me go, or maybe they didn't care enough to notice I was gone. In that house, silence was always more comfortable than curiosity. They preferred the version of me they had already decided on, underwhelming, compliant, and forgettable, a background character who didn't need lines, just an apron. So I let them keep the illusion. Meanwhile, I worked nights they didn't see, just not the ones they expected. No more polished cutlery or linen napkins. No more carrying trays to guests who couldn't remember I existed the next day. Instead, I stood in a stripped-down commercial unit off 9th Avenue, what used to be a laundromat before someone converted it into a food-safe facility. No signage, no windows, just a rolling shutter and a back door for drivers. It smelled like bleach, sesame oil, and exhaustion. It was perfect. Ghost kitchens aren't glamorous, but that's why they work. No front-of-house staff, no decor, no scripted greetings or forced smiles, just ingredients, prep time, and digital efficiency. I started by renting night slots in someone else's unit. A prep cook I knew had a cousin who leased his permit on the weekends. He didn't ask questions. I didn't offer answers. I picked 2 menu items that were cheap to make and impossible to ruin in transit: sesame, rice bowls, and chili noodles. No frills, no branding, just speed, consistency, and heat retention. Most people spend their startup budget on logos. I spent mine on insulating containers. It paid off. Week after week, the order count rose, first 5, then 20, then a steady climb toward a number that made my hands shake the first time I ran the reports. I never told anyone at home. They thought I was still waitressing. They made their usual comments when I left in uniform. My sister asked if I'd ever consider real estate or admin work, something more appropriate for my skill set. I smiled, nodded, left the room. At the kitchen, I was already training 2 part-time runners and negotiating with a third-party logistics service to cut driver costs. 0 dining overhead. They said I wasn't creative, so I reverse-engineered their favorite restaurant's menu by ordering it 5 nights in a row and tracking the thermal decay. They said I'd never understand business. So I read 6 finance books and cold-called a supplier to negotiate wholesale rates, like I owned a chain. And slowly I did. The margins were tight at first. I wasn't making a fortune. But I wasn't bleeding either. Every dollar went back in. Every night I ran the numbers. Every morning I showed up early to prep. And I waited. Not for recognition, but for data. For patterns, volume curves, customer preferences. For the day, I could make a move that wasn't reaction, but strategy. I started licensing out sub-kitchen slots when the orders spilled over into double digits per hour. By the time my name appeared on the business registry, I already had 2 rotating chefs and a delivery network bigger than any family-owned restaurant on the block. Still, I kept quiet. There were no press releases, no social media posts, no clumsy announcements at the dinner table. Let them keep laughing. Let them keep underestimating me. They were good at that. What they didn't realize was that my silence was never surrender. It was bandwidth. The night of my sister's bridal shower, while she posed for pictures and Dad made speeches, I stood by the sink rinsing glassware in silence. My hands were pruned, my back ached, and my father had just suggested I'd do better marrying a dishwasher. I smiled the way he taught me to smile, tight, polite, and forgettable. But that night, when the guests were gone and the laughter had faded, I opened my laptop and signed the lease on a second kitchen. I knew I wasn't done. I knew what came next. I didn't buy the restaurant out of anger. I bought it because the numbers made sense. The lease was expiring. The owner, an aging third-generation chef, was exhausted, months behind on payroll, and too proud to accept that the world had changed faster than his menu. He wasn't greedy. He was tired. We met twice, once in the back kitchen, once in silence. The third time, he slid a manila envelope across the table and said, "It's yours if you want it, but don't turn it into a TikTok circus." I told him I wouldn't. I meant it. I didn't want to change the space. Not yet. I wanted everything to stay exactly how they remembered it. The checkered tablecloths, the exposed brick, the same smell of garlic and lemon that had drifted through my sister's engagement party. I kept the servers, I kept the chef, I kept the name, the layout, even the wine glasses she'd clinked during her toast. And then I kept quiet. No announcements, no grand reveal. I paid the vendors, I fixed the books, I modernized the back-end systems without changing the front. It was like slipping into a costume that fit perfectly because I'd been watching it for years. They came back, of course. Not my family, not yet. But their friends, their neighbors, their colleagues from the bank and the bridal boutique and the country club circuit. They booked tables like nothing had changed. They requested the same dishes, told the same stories, complimented the same ambiance they once believed I wasn't good enough to be seated in. Some of them remembered me as the waitress. A few smiled vaguely like they were trying to place my face. I let them guess. I didn't correct anyone. And when someone asked, "Do you still work here?" I nodded once and walked away. It wasn't the lie that mattered. It was the silence. Silence is heavier than shame. It makes people nervous. It forces them to fill in the blanks themselves. And most of the time, they get it wrong, beautifully, painfully wrong. That was part of the plan, because eventually, I knew my sister would return. Not because of me, because of the venue. The restaurant had sentimental value. She posted about it often. Where he proposed, she'd captioned one photo. Where we picked the risotto for the wedding. I didn't have to lure her, I just had to wait. And waiting, I've learned, is one of my best skills. So I didn't push. I didn't post. I just ran the numbers and managed the staff and signed the contracts. Silently, invisibly. Until one night her name appeared on the reservation list. A table for 4, 7:30 p.m. No special notes, no extra requests, just her fiancé's name on the confirmation email and her initials in the guest notes. I stared at the screen for longer than I should have. Not because I was nervous, not because I was angry, because I wanted to get it right. Not dramatic, not cruel, just exact. That's when I commissioned the plaque. Nothing ornate, no glitter, just a small brushed bronze square mounted discreetly on the brick column beside table 3, the one they used for the toast. It read, "To the waitress they laughed at. Owner." No names, no dates, no hashtags, just wait. Let them recognize it, let them deny it. Either way, they'd feel it. And that, I knew, would be enough. They came in dressed for importance. My sister wore cream, not white, never that obvious, but close enough to catch the eye of anyone glancing her way. Her fiancé had that polished stiffness of someone uncomfortable in cufflinks, the kind who smiles too hard because he's afraid of looking small in front of her. They were followed by the usual crowd. 3 couples in seasonal pastels, curated for Instagram and seated for optics more than comfort. They didn't need to say their name at the host stand. She recognized them, not because I told her, because I trained her. Every host at my restaurant is taught the same thing. Power doesn't announce itself. It arrives with poise, and it speaks last. They were guided to table 3. I chose that table on purpose. It's positioned beneath the mezzanine wall where the lighting is soft, but the bronze plaque still catches a reflection if you tilt your head. Not too showy, not attention-seeking, just enough to be seen when it matters. I watched everything from upstairs. The mezzanine office has no decor, just security feeds, a clean ledger, and silence. The kind of room you go to when you want to see the world without being seen. She touched the back of the chair like it might burn her. Then she saw it. She squinted, hesitated, and leaned in just slightly, the way someone does when they're pretending not to care about what they already know. And she read it. To the waitress they laughed at. The words weren't dramatic. They didn't need to be. The weight of them wasn't in the phrasing. It was in the memory they carried. That memory had a smell: sautéed garlic, melted butter, overheated champagne. It had a color: the blush pink dress she wore when she gave her toast. It had a sound: forks pausing mid-air when she raised her glass and said, "Here's to family, and here's to my incredible father for raising a real daughter." No one corrected her. Not then. Not even my father, who just laughed and leaned back in his chair, pleased by the compliment like it was his to earn. They remembered it that night. You could see it in their posture. The slight shift when the waiter poured the wine. The stiffness in her neck. The tension in his smile. Her fiancé noticed something was off. "What's wrong?" he asked quietly, like a man sensing a current he couldn't name. She shook her head. "Nothing," she said. "Just weird joke." She said it too fast. The kind of fast that tells you it's not a joke at all. She didn't order the risotto she once mocked. She ordered chicken, safe, familiar, unmemorable, and when the wine came, she didn't raise her glass. There was no toast, no speech, no proud laughter about making it, only muted silverware and the kind of stillness that creeps in when you realize the floor underneath you belongs to someone else now. They paid the bill. They thanked the waiter. They walked out without dessert. Not once did she look up at the plaque again. Because she didn't have to. She knew it was still there. She knew what it meant. And more importantly, she knew who put it there. But I never came downstairs. I never asked how the meal was. I never approached the table. Because revenge doesn't need a performance. It just needs permanence. And a quiet place on the wall where people can come to eat. And remember who served the first course. They booked under a different name. Not my father's. Not even his wife's. Just Marshall, like it was some kind of neutral ground, as if distance in a surname might soften what they'd done, as if I wouldn't notice the request for the back corner booth, the one with privacy, the one they once called hers. They asked for Thursday, a slow night, less crowd, more control. I didn't deny the reservation. I confirmed it myself. Then I made sure the lighting in that section was just dim enough to feel hidden, but just bright enough to see the plaque, if you knew to look for it. He arrived first. My father always walked like the floor owed him stability, like gravity existed for his benefit, not as a rule for everyone else. He wore a blazer too formal for the weather and shoes polished for attention, not comfort. He scanned the room like a man returning to an old office, as if something inside him still believed this was his domain. It wasn't. The hostess greeted him by the name on the reservation, flat, professional, polite. She didn't flinch when he raised an eyebrow. She just walked him to the table. He sat down slowly, studied the menu he once mocked, touched the wine list like it confused him. Then he looked around. Not at the other diners, not at the kitchen. He was looking for me. I stayed behind the glass on the second floor, no sound, no movement. just the steady hum of justice cooling to room temperature. When his wife arrived, she kissed him on the cheek, smiled tightly, and whispered something I couldn't hear, but her eyes landed on the same plaque. She froze, not dramatically, just for a breath. That was all I needed. They didn't order much. A salad, a filet, no wine, no laughter. Halfway through the meal, my father finally asked to see the owner. He said it like it was still a favor, like he expected someone else to appear, some silent partner in a pressed shirt, ready to accept his handshake. The hostess didn't answer. She only walked upstairs. I didn't go down right away. I let time settle in their throats. When I stepped onto the main floor, the room didn't hush. No one noticed. No music changed. No plates paused mid-air. That's how real power arrives, unannounced, unbothered, and uninterested in applause. I walked to the table without smiling. He looked up. He didn't stand. "You own this place?" he asked. "I do," I said. He blinked, then scoffed. "Well," he said, "guess I underestimated you." "No," I replied. "You measured me by the wrong scale." His wife said nothing. I could feel her tension, sitting there in silence, too proud to apologize and too smart to pretend ignorance. She kept her eyes on her knife, pushing vegetables around like she could still control something. He tried to recover. "Maybe we got off on the wrong foot," he began. "We were hoping to talk about the family business, about legacy." I waited. "I was thinking," he continued, "maybe we could—" I cut him off gently. "This is a restaurant, Mr. Marshall, not a time machine." He didn't like that. He stiffened. His hand flexed over the napkin, like he wanted to argue but didn't know which version of me to argue with, the one who bussed tables or the one who owned the lease. I let the silence expand. Then I placed a small envelope on the table, black, simple, unmarked. Inside, a formal offer to purchase their remaining shares of the collapsed family company, a number higher than market value, clean, legal, final. "You can sign it," I said, "or not. Makes no difference to me. Either way, you're no longer needed in the kitchen." Then I turned and walked away. Not fast, not dramatic, just calm, even, because power doesn't chase applause. It writes the check, clears the table, and sets the reservation policy. And that night, for the first time, my father sat at a table he couldn't command, and left without finishing his meal. My father returned the next night, not for the food, not even for the table. He didn't sit down. He stood just past the entrance, long enough to make the staff nervous, long enough to see the plaque. It wasn't hidden. It was placed deliberately, right by the host stand, angled in the exact spot where a guest would pause before being seated. He read it twice, once as a joke, then again as a threat. I didn't speak. I stayed just behind the service partition, invisible to everyone but him. He didn't call me by name. He didn't ask how I'd done it. And he didn't apologize. Instead, he said something that told me everything I needed to know. "This place used to have heart," he murmured. "Now it feels like a funeral." Then he left. Quietly. Like he'd just remembered he was no longer the guest of honor. And I let him leave. Because I knew what he really saw wasn't the restaurant. It wasn't the lighting, the menu, or the decor. It was permanence. The kind you can't laugh away or dress down or uninvite. He didn't know it yet. But this would be the last family event he ever attended where he didn't have to ask for a seat. And next time, he'd need a reservation. The restaurant didn't change overnight. It still served the same kind of food, the same wine pairings, the same Thursday jazz. But everything beneath the surface had shifted. The wait staff knew who signed their checks. The chefs stopped ignoring my input. The vendors stopped assuming I was just someone's assistant. And the regulars, those who used to nod past me as if I were part of the decor, began to notice my presence and my absence. I didn't take my family off the guest list. I didn't need to. They stopped coming on their own. Maybe it was the plaque. Maybe it was the silence. Or maybe it was because deep down they knew I had nothing left to prove and nothing left to give. But I'll tell you what stayed. That moment at my sister's engagement party. When I stood in uniform, not as a guest, not as a daughter, but as a fixture, a convenience, a joke. "One of my daughters made it," he had said, glass raised. "The other, well, maybe she'll marry a dishwasher, stay in her league." That line stayed with me longer than the champagne stain on my apron. So when the venue officially became mine, I didn't redesign everything. Just one thing. There's a small table near the entrance now, set for two, white cloth, polished silver, reserved, always. No one sits there, but the place cards remain, his name on one, mine on the other. No one serves it, because that course is mine, and it's already been served.